All right, let's continue our look at the primeval history of Genesis by going on and talking a little bit about Genesis 3 through 11, following up on our previous lecture pertaining to Genesis 1 and 2. In this lecture, I'd like to really have four main elements I'd like to focus on. Number one, we will talk about Genesis 3, the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Secondly, we'll go on and say a few things about Genesis 4. Then third, we will go on and talk a little bit about the flood narrative. And finally, fourth, we'll talk about the Tower of Babel as the story is narrated in chapter 11. As we begin then on Genesis 3, I want to make sure to remind you and make sure that it's at the forefront of your mind that Genesis 3 is a continuation of the story that we read in Genesis 2 of the second creation story. So even though we looked at Genesis 1 and 2 together in one lecture and then kind of broke it off to start with Genesis 3 in this lecture, from a literary perspective, Genesis 3 really does belong with Genesis 2 because, again, it's simply a continuation of the story. Genesis 2, the creation of the Garden of Eden and the placing of Adam and Eve there. Then Genesis 3, the story about what happens when they are there and the disobedience of God's command. And so what I'd like to do is proceed through the story kind of section by section, making a few comments about some of these verses as we go along. Following the last verse in chapter 2, where it tells us that the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed, we move then to the story of the serpent coming and approaching Eve and inviting her to disobey God's command pertaining to one of the trees. The story begins by noting that the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. Now, the Hebrew word for crafty is very similar to the Hebrew word for naked, which is going to play an important role later on in the story. So already we see that this very astute author is using some interesting wordplay to entertain his audience and to draw them into the story and to help them make some of these connections that he has in mind. The snake comes to Eve and begins to ask her a question. Now, again, let's remember that the snake or the serpent here is nowhere described as Satan. That's kind of become a common part of contemporary Christian belief, I think, that in the form of a snake, Satan came and tempted Eve. But notice that the story does not say that anywhere. Here in Genesis, in the biblical text, it describes it only as a talking serpent and nothing more. And so the serpent says to Eve in verse 1, "Did God say you shall not eat from any tree in the garden?" The serpent here is already using some psychological techniques to begin to implant in Eve's mind the idea that God is more restrictive than he is. Tries to give Eve the impression that he's more restrictive by adding to what God had said. We know that back in chapter 2, of course, God had simply told Adam that you can eat of any tree in the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But the serpent makes that addition to it and changes it from any tree in the garden. As he does, he begins to kind of work his way into her mind. When Eve responds to the serpent, the first part of her statement is correct, where she says, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden." But what's interesting is that here, Eve adds a little bit to it, it would seem, by saying that God also added, "Nor shall you touch it, or you shall die." Now, back in chapter 2, remember, God didn't say anything to Adam about touching the fruit. So either Adam didn't quite give Eve the completely correct command, or perhaps Eve is not repeating to the snake the command exactly as she heard it from Adam. But either way, Eve herself seems to make God sound perhaps more restrictive than he is by saying that God had also added the phrase, "Nor shall you touch it." As we continue on, the serpent is going to respond to Eve and talk Adam and Eve into disobeying by eating this fruit from the tree. The serpent tells them, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And so it really is knowledge that the man and the woman are after here, and the snake knows that that is the way to tempt them to do what he wants them to do. There's been a lot of discussion over what exactly the phrase good and evil means. Some people say that this is perhaps giving moral sense to Adam and Eve, that they are going to know the difference between good and evil in the sense of knowing the difference between right and wrong and so forth. Other people, however, argue more convincingly that really this is just a merismus for saying all things. So in other words, when the snake says you will know good and evil, what the snake is really saying is you will know everything. You will know what's good, you will know what's evil, and you will know everything in between. And so, in other words, your eyes will be open, and with this new knowledge, you will be like God. In the last lecture, when we talked about Jay, you might remember that we said one of the hallmarks of Jay, one of the hallmarks of his thinking, is that sin consists primarily in the desire to be like God, pride, the desire to usurp the place of God, and that kind of thing. The serpent understands this, and so Jay uses the serpent to illustrate that point. How is it that Adam and Eve are talked into disobeying? By being presented with this possibility of knowing all things. Some people have even offered the suggestion that perhaps what's going on here is kind of a critique of the monarchy. Again, we said that early on, one of the more common theories is that Jay wrote perhaps during the time of Solomon. When we get to the reign of Solomon in 1 Kings 1 to 12, we are going to see that King Solomon had a tremendous amount of pride and a tremendous amount of problem, it would seem, with his own ego, and that ended up being a major part of his downfall. So some people have suggested that maybe this story is kind of meant as a little bit of a subtle jab at a monarch and his administration who think that they know all things. We don't know for sure, but the story is interesting. It continues to be interesting. Verse 6 tells us that when the woman saw that the tree was good for the food and a delight to the eyes and to be desired to make one wise, so it looks nice, it can make you wise, she took of it and ate, and she gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate as well. Now here in verse 7, we see that the immediate result of this act is shame over their nakedness. They all of a sudden become aware that they are naked, and so they sew fig leaves together to cover themselves. Of course, right after that, God is going to come in the garden looking for them. And so, as we said, Jay tends to portray God in anthropomorphic terms, and here's a good example of that. It's interesting that God does not directly level an accusation of disobedience against the couple, but rather he allows them to indict himself, the same as he will do in chapter 4 when we get to the story of Cain and Abel. God will come walking in the garden, and he will call to the man and say, "Where are you?" And Adam will explain that when he saw God coming, or when he heard God coming, rather, he was afraid because he was naked and he hid himself. God then asked the question, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?" So Adam's shame over his nakedness here is a direct result of what he has done, and that kind of becomes proof to Adam that he has sinned, but also to Adam that he cannot escape God's knowledge of what he has done. Of course, the man is not going to take responsibility for his action, but he is going to try to pass the buck by saying, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit from the tree, and I ate." Then God is going to say to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" And the woman is going to also not take responsibility, but she will pass the buck to the serpent. And she will say, "The serpent tricked me, and I ate." And so following this, God is going to announce his punishment on these three parties. First on the serpent, then on the woman, and then finally on Adam. The punishment on the serpent is going to be that he will crawl on his belly. So this becomes an etiological explanation for why snakes do not have feet. The punishment, of course, to the woman is that she will bear children only in great pain. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you at the end of chapter 16. There are several suggestions for the interpretation of this verse that have been offered. Some people suggest that this last phrase of verse 16 kind of explains conflict between the sexes, why men and women, as they are married in the marital relationship, tend to have conflict with one another and both have their own desires. Other people have pointed out that when the snake says, or when God says, rather, your desire shall be for your husband, he shall rule over you, he is talking about sexual desire. In other words, even in spite of the pain which you are going to have in childbirth, you are going to still have enough sexual desire for your husband that you will desire to be intimate with him. And so pregnancy is going to come about even if you know the pain that's going to result 9 months later. And then, of course, to the man, God says, because you have listened to the voice of your life and have eaten of the tree, cursed is the ground because of you. We talked in chapter 2 about how there is kind of this harmonious, interdependent relationship between the man and the ground. But now that peaceful relationship between man and the ground has been broken because of what the man has done. So instead of the ground repaying Adam's efforts to work it with fairly easy growth of food, and now it's going to bring forth thorns and thistles, and Adam shall eat the plants of the field, and he says, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you will return. That relationship between the man and the ground now is not anymore a peaceful, mutually beneficial one, but rather it is going to cause a whole lot of pain and is going to be a kind of punishment. Okay? And so in verses 20 through 24, we're going to see the end of the story. The first thing that God is going to do is going to make garments for the man and his wife to cover them in their nakedness, because apparently those fig leaves they were using don't go through the wash very well. And then in chapters 22 through 24, God is going to say that now that man knows good and evil, or knows all things, he is going to send him out of the garden so that he cannot eat from the fruit that is in the tree of life and thereby gain immortality. And so the story ends with Adam and Eve being sent away from where they have been living. There are 4 key elements then in this story that I want to bring to your attention by way of conclusion and summary. First of all, this story is going to contain an offense, that is, they are going to eat the fruit. Secondly, after the offense, there is going to be a decree from God, where God is going to come and God is going to make a speech to them announcing what the consequences are going to be. And then third, we're going to have a punishment. Verses 2 to 4, the punishment in this case is sending them out of the garden and not allowing them back in. However, there is also an act of grace, an amelioration or a softening of this punishment that will take place in verse 21, which notice is actually before the punishment. Okay? And so that amelioration here in verse 21 is going to be that the Lord God is going to make garments or skins for the human beings to lessen the effects of their sin and of the punishment. Okay, let's move on now to Genesis chapter 4, the story of Cain and Abel. And we're going to see that those same 4 elements that we saw in chapter 3 are also in chapter 4. In other words, once again, we are going to have an offense. Cain is going to kill his brother Abel out of jealousy because God does not accept Cain's offering as God accepted Abel's offering. Of course, one of the great unanswered questions of humankind, perhaps, is why God was not willing to accept that offering from Cain, and the story really doesn't tell us, but there has been a lot of speculation over the years. The other thing that these stories have in common is that in both Genesis 3 and Genesis 4, the offense is kind of an attempt by human beings to take the place of God or to become like God. Eve takes from the fruit of the tree because the snake promises her it will give her the same kind of knowledge that God has. Now, Cain, in killing his brother, is going to take for himself the decision that belongs only to God, the decision to take a human life. Like in the story of the Garden of Eden, God is going to come and God is going to make a decree. Once again, this decree is going to refer to the ground and the breaking of the relationship between humankind and the ground. You are cursed from the ground, God tells Cain, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength, and you will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. So once again, God announces a punishment that will result in a fractured, broken, hostile relationship between a human and the earth. Also, thirdly, like in the previous story, we're going to have a punishment. Verse 16, Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Okay? So again, as we saw in the Garden of Eden story, so also in this account, the punishment has to do with having to move off to a distance and go off to a different location. And then finally, once again, we're also going to have an act of grace, an act of amelioration of that punishment that God has brought on the people. And that is going to be in verse 15. So once again, the amelioration is going to occur before the punishment itself takes place. And in this case, the amelioration, of course, is the black mark, or some kind of mark. I guess it doesn't tell us a color, that God is going to put on Cain to protect his life and make sure that nobody can take justice into their own hands. Following the story of Cain and Abel itself, we're going to have a brief section in verses 17 to 26 of that chapter, which are going to talk about some of the ancient human ancestors of ancient civilization. And really all throughout human history, ancient peoples have told about their ancestors who brought to the human race various kinds of skills, what are sometimes called the arts of civilization. And so we have an example of that here, like in verse 20, where Jabal is the ancestor of those who live in tents and have livestock, and his brother Jubal was the ancestor of those who played the lyre, and Tubal-Cain brought metallurgy to humankind, and so on and so forth. Eventually, at the end of the story, we're going to get to Adam and Eve's next son, Seth, who is going to be able to continue the population. Chapter 5 is going to be the first major genealogy that we're going to have in Genesis. Genesis is going to have a good number of these that are always going to kind of set the framework for the whole book and mark the transition from one part of the book to the next. And then finally, let's go talk a little bit about the flood narrative. The flood narrative kind of has its preface in chapter 6, verses 1 to 4. Another very curious story about the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans, that the human women were fair and beautiful, and so they take wives for themselves. And God says, my spirit shall not abide in mortals forever. They are flesh, their days shall be 120 years. And so this kind of explains in ideological fashion of why human life is limited to 120 years. I think this story also illustrates once more the breaking of the boundaries between the divine world and humankind, although in this case the initiation of that breaking of the boundary comes from above rather than from beneath. In any case, this race of Nephilim that seem to have developed on the earth as a result of this probably has some kind of connection with verse 5, which is going to lead us into the story of the flood itself. And so let's take a little look at the outline of the flood story. This is according to the scholar Nahum Sarna, who's done a whole lot of writing on Genesis. In verses 5 through 8, which really comes before Sarna's outline, we're going to have once again, in a sense, an offense against God. In verse 5, it will tell us that the Lord saw the wickedness of humankind, that it was great on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. So here now, the offense, instead of being a single act, as it was in Genesis 3 and 4, is going to be general, overall, widespread wickedness among human beings. And it's also going to relate not only to the actions, but as it says, to the inclination of their heart. So already here, the writers of Genesis really have, I think, a very excellent understanding of human nature, and of the difficult, of the sin-prone nature of human beings, and that it is that inner intention, that sin-prone inner intention of the heart that eventually leads to sinful activity. Now, to start the flood story itself, then, Sarna says it will begin with the instructions from God in chapter 6, verses 9 through 22. I'm not going to talk a lot about J and P, the sources in the flood story, but if you're interested, I have posted with this module a sheet of paper that kind of shows that shows which parts of this were contributed by J, according to scholars, and which parts can probably be attributed to P. And it's interesting that if you separate those out, which you can do because of the different fonts I use, if you separate the J and P versions out in your mind, each of them essentially makes sense on its own. But now, again, we're dealing with the text in its final form. And so it has been put back together so that the instructions from God are going to start in chapter 6, verses 9 to 22, where God promises that he's going to bring a flood of waters on the earth, and everything to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. And in Sarna's outline, the next part of the flood narrative is going to be chapter 7, which is going to describe the coming of the flood waters on the earth and the deepening of the flood and so forth. I guess the verses that I would draw especially to your attention in this story would be verses such as verses 11 and 12 of chapter 7. You'll notice that on this certain day, it tells us, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. The rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Now, when it talks about the windows of the heavens being opened, I'd like you to remember the creation of the firmament in the heavens on the second day of creation. So what's happening here is that God is opening up that firmament that God had originally used to hold back the waters of chaos. And that, again, is letting the waters of chaos come back through. And in addition, it's telling that the fountains of the great deep burst forth. So some of those waters that God had stored away under the earth to keep away from human life, once again, God is allowing those waters to come back in as well. And so essentially what's taking place here is that we have a partial reversal of God's original action of creation. God, when he created the universe, kept the waters away and moved the waters of chaos away from humankind so that the earth could support them. And now God has kind of reversed that process and allowed those waters of chaos to come back in once again. Kind of the turning point then of the flood story is going to be chapter 8, verse 1. It will tell us that God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and all the domestic animals that were with him in the ark. That when it talks about God remembering in the Old Testament at several points, what it refers to is God all of a sudden having grace and mercy on his people who are struggling, which God is going to do here. He's going to bring the waters down, and they are gradually going to decrease. The birds that Noah is going to send out after the flood to check for dry ground, those are also in the Gilgamesh epic, which is kind of the ancient Near Eastern version of the flood story. And it's interesting to read. A lot of times people have to read it in English classes in high school or college along the way, so you may be familiar with that. If you have a chance, I would encourage you to take a look at it again sometime. And then finally, in chapter 8, verses 15 to chapter 9, verses 17, we're going to have the restoration of harmony between God and humankind. In chapter 8, especially like verses 20 through 22, we're going to have the J version in the end of the flood story. Verse 21 has always been one of my favorite verses of the Bible. When the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind. Again, referring to the Gilgamesh epic at the end of the flood story that is part of the Gilgamesh epic. Once again, when the Noah character builds this fire All of the gods gather around to smell the smoke because they're hungry. Human life on earth had died for a long time, and the gods needed to eat, so they were famished and came and smelled the smoke so they could again be fed. Once more, a significant difference between the Old Testament and the ancient Near Eastern literature, where, of course, the Israelites worship a God who in no sense needs to be fed or depends on human beings for sustenance. There is then, in this restoration of harmony, also a couple more things in chapter 9 I draw to your attention. The relationship between humankind and the rest of creation is going to be changed a little bit. Now humankind is also going to be able to eat meat. So the author apparently is writing the story with the assumption that before that, humans had to be vegetarians, and also we're going to have capital punishment is going to become part of God's plan for humankind as well. Finally, the later part of chapter 9 is going to refer to this agreement, if you will, between God and human beings, or this promise from God to Noah as a covenant. Covenant being a sacred agreement and relation established the relationship between God and human beings. We'll talk quite a bit more about the role of covenant in the Bible and its connection with the ancient Near East in subsequent chapters, but this is the first time that that term is mentioned in the Old Testament. So finally, Genesis is going to bring the primeval history to a close with the story of the Tower of Babel. Now, before we get to the Tower of Babel in chapter 10, we're going to have one more genealogy. And this genealogy is going to divide the families of the earth into three major lines according to the lines of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And we'll notice that the sons of Shem are going to be the sons that are eventually, or the children of Ham. The line of Ham is eventually what's going to lead to Israel. And then notice Ham, he's the son who is going to be cursed in the story of Noah's drunkenness. It is from him that the Canaanites are going to come. So that story of Noah's cursing of Ham really has to do, I think, to explain the contentious relationship between Israel and the Canaanites as they are trying to deal with them in their land once God has given them the land of Canaan. As we go to the Tower of Babel, then we're going to find out that this story of disobedience and rebellion against God is going to have the same basic structure as we saw in the Garden of Eden story and in the Cain and Abel story. So first of all, there is going to be an offense in chapter 11, verse 4. At first glance, it doesn't seem that this should be much of an offense. After all, one might ask, what is wrong with building the tower? I think the clue to that is in some specific wording of verse 4, where the people say, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." I think here it is the effort with that tower to make a name for themselves rather than to make a name for God that is getting the people into trouble. In other words, once again, we're running into pride in the attempt to be like God, being as the fundamental at the fundamental root of human sin. In a sense, then, I think the author is trying to suggest that really nothing has changed following the flood. The hope, I guess, was that by starting over, God would again give birth to a new civilization through Noah, and things might turn out differently this time. But then the author inserts the story of the Tower of Babel to show that that's not at all the case. Human beings once again retain the pride that we saw that they had previously. God is going to come down, and God is going to issue a decree. This time, God will say they are one people and one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there so that they will not understand one another's speech. Okay? Third, we're going to have a punishment. The Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Scholars have noted that often in Genesis, the punishment for what somebody does fits the crime. And that is certainly true here, because I think another part of the crime or the offense, another part of what the people are doing wrong here, is that they are trying to avoid being scattered abroad through the earth. In verse 4, Again, the people say, let us make a name for ourselves, otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Now, think back again to Genesis 1:28. What is the blessing and the command that God gives the people? To multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. God wants the people to fill the entire earth, and here they are trying to directly avoid that blessing and command. And so God is going to confuse their language so that they end up fulfilling God's original intention of scattering about and filling the earth. The question in this story is what we might call the amelioration. Now, notice we really don't have anything that would fulfill this rule. No act of grace or mercy by which God reduces the effects of their sin. However, many times it's been suggested that the amelioration here is actually going to be fulfilled by the rest of Genesis, perhaps indeed by the rest of the Old Testament. In other words, the act of grace and mercy here is that God is going to call a particular individual and his family and the people who will come out of that family to form and to have a special relationship with him as his own people. So in a sense, the promise to Abraham that we're going to see in the next module, in the beginning of the Abraham cycle, will somehow function as that amelioration. And so in a very nice way, the authors and the editors here have set us up to move into the story of Abraham. Previously, God had attempted to deal with all humankind. That has not worked. Humankind remains rebellious. Now God is going to bless humankind through one individual and his families, we will soon see. Before we get to that, we're going to have one more genealogy at the end of chapter 11, which will kind of draw the connection between the time of Noah and finally the time of Abram. Thanks for joining me for this module. I am going to enjoy participating with you in looking at the discussion questions, and we will begin the rest of Genesis in the following module.